For our third speaker of the session, we have Tava Olsen. Tava is a professor of operations management and supply chain management at the University of Auckland Business School. Just another interesting thing about her appointment there that if I've read her website correctly, is that she took a nice break from doing the heavy admin work of being deputy dean by being a department chair of 2 different departments at once, which is quite impressive. She also has a lot of impressive research spanning a lot of different areas. I think that's a theme of this session. So inventory, supply chain, services, healthcare, agriculture, really all over. And then also service-wise, she is a area editor at Operations Research and a senior editor at POM, I believe, and previously was the president of the MSOM Society. So Tava, thank you very much. Look forward to the talk.
Thank you very much. So yes, and as of 1st of November, I will be Deputy Dean, going back into that admin role at Melbourne Business School. So yeah, I'm moving there in about a month. So yes, busy time. Won't be an Informs, unfortunately, but anyway. So this work I'm going to talk about is, most of this presentation is new work, but I am going to end with a bit more of the broad perspective. So if you know me, I've actually been thinking about this area for quite a while. So this idea of lead time, quotation and pricing and make to order or service environments, I guess I should have called it. Same thing when it comes to the model, really. Is something I've been doing a while. But most of this talk is going to be based on new work that is actually a combination of an empirical study that we've done, which I won't spend a whole lot of time on, given this is a queuing audience, but it is the motivation for the models. And so there's 3 different models that I'll be presenting. And then, as I mentioned, I'll talk a bit more about older work that I have in this area, but also, open problems that I see. I still think there's a lot of work that can be done in this area. I think there's a lot of interesting problems here. So the talk, for most of the talk, I want to talk about quoting lead times when quotes directly affect customer satisfaction. So this paper, which actually is about to turn into 2 papers, is joint work with Ricardo Mogre, who's at Durham, and my colleague Valery Pavlov from Auckland. So here's the idea. So you've ordered your online delivery for 7:30 a.m. and the guy shows up at 6:30 a.m. and you're not really too excited about that because you're still sound asleep and your alarm hasn't gone off. So there are clearly situations where an early delivery may not be a plus. There are other situations where early is good, right? If you're stuck in an emergency department and you get called sooner than you expected, all good, right? So that's not the setting we're going to be talking about here. We're going to be talking about the setting where early is not good and late is even worse. So you don't like when things are late, but you may not be very happy when things are early. So, we're claiming this as a situation, but does that actually hold in practice? That's where our empirical work came in. So the motivation for this study was the idea that, I've been working for a while in the area where we quote lead times, prices, due dates, etc. But there's also an reference point effect going on here, right? As soon as you give your quote, that's actually going to affect your customer satisfaction. So what we started with here is the idea that the customer's perceptions of waiting time and the quotes jointly affect their satisfaction. So most existing research is either the effects of the quotes or the waits, but we want to actually look at that interaction and this idea that a quote may actually form a reference point. So before we went too far down the modeling side of things, we did actually want to have a bit more empirical. So there is a large literature on reference-dependent utility. So I would emphasize all these dots here. I've undoubtedly offended people on the screen. Just imagine yourself in the dots. Because there are large literatures in all of these three areas. And so the one that's sort of new in terms of lead time quotation is this idea of this reference-dependent utility. So, the idea that when you quote something, it forms a reference point, that's not new, but to marry this in with either delay announcements or lead time quotation, which are really sort of two sides of a very similar coin, is what's new here. So we actually started this work thinking about both situations where short is good and short is bad. And then the idea that short is good has been verified in previous empirical studies. It's kind of the natural thing. So we ended up focusing more on the inconvenience, the short might be bad side of things. I think there's still research to do also on the reference point idea when short is good. But the focus of my talk here is when that delivery person is waking you up at 6:30 a.m. So let's see if, without waking people up at 6:30 a.m., let's see if we can actually see that effect in practice. So we did, as I said, we did an empirical study. We used MTurk to actually design, run our experiment. And we had two hypotheses with multiple parts. The first is just making sure, hypothesis one is just, making sure that everything's behaving as we should. So overall satisfaction, so we're going to give people a payoff. The overall satisfaction is going to increase with that payoff and decrease with the waiting time. Pretty natural. The satisfaction with the waiting time decreases with the waiting time. Better, that would be weird if it didn't. And the satisfaction with the quote accuracy decreases regardless of whether the waiting time's shorter or longer. So what you'll see that I'm sort of building up to here is we've actually got three forms of satisfaction. We've got satisfaction with the wait, satisfaction with the quote, and then overall satisfaction. So it's overall satisfaction that we're going to be looking at in hypothesis 2A and 2B. And we've written these hypotheses based on what the literature says, but the second one is actually opposite to what we're expecting to see. So the first one says a quote where you wait longer than your quote, you're unhappy. Fine, we'd be surprised if we don't see that. And then what the literature would say is if you see something shorter than your quote, you should be happier, you should be increasing your overall. We're expecting to not see that, but we've written it based on what the literature says. So here's our experimental design. As I said, it's an MTurk experiment where we're paying people real money. We're giving them quotes. So they were either quoted 5 minutes or 7 minutes. And then actual waits were between -2 and +2 minutes of that. So anywhere between 3 minutes and 9 minutes. Random assignments of participants. We know that they're actually going to wait between 3 and 9. We told them it was going to be between 2 and 10. And they had to confirm their waiting at the end of the wait. If they managed, if they managed to confirm their wait successfully, they got paid a bonus for doing that. So what does the screen look like? Basically, the screen looks like this, not in yellow. You'll be between, this one's 2 and 8, but anyway, approximately quote of 5 minutes. You've been weighted in 4.53, and this has popped up saying you must click the next button before the time expires. You've got 7 seconds left. So this popped up 13 seconds ago. We gave them 20 seconds to confirm. And if they weren't on this particular screen, they weren't paying attention, then they never got to click the next button. They didn't get the bonus for successfully completing the experiment. They did get the 50 cents for actually starting the experiment. Obviously, those people who failed to click next aren't in our data set because they're going to be very unhappy people. So we don't include them, but we do include everybody who did successfully click next, regardless on when they did so. So we had 534 where 493 went through to the end, and then of those 493, 432 were actually successful. And for those 432, average wait was 6 minutes, average payment, including the show-up fee, was $1.74. So yeah, it's an experimental study. We've got a bunch of variables, and so we're dividing into whether they're actually waiting more or less than their quote. And their quote was either, as I said, 5 or 7. So there's this weight gap of what they actually wait. We control for gender, age, education, all the things you'd want to control for. And as I mentioned, we have these 3 satisfactions. So satisfaction is just self-reported on a Likert scale, satisfaction with the quote, satisfaction with the waiting time, and overall satisfaction. So everything is nice and lovely and very significant in hypothesis 1. So for example, so this is overall satisfaction, satisfaction with the wait, and satisfaction with the quote. So the longer the wait, the less happy you are with the wait, and the less happy you are overall. But in satisfaction with your quote, you're not very satisfied with the quote accuracy, either direction. So we, hypothesis 2, we'll be looking at overall satisfaction, but for now, sure, we're not happy with the quote if it's not an accurate quote. So the more interesting one is hypothesis 2, where indeed, if you wait longer than your quote, you're unhappy, whether or not you control for these satisfactions with quote and waiting time. But we didn't have enough to say anything about the underquote. So we had to collect more data. So we collected more data. So we collected 283, of which 205 are new, and just narrowed down to this treatment. So we either have a quote of 5 or we have a quote of 7, and we either have a waiting time of 5 or we have a waiting time of 7. So these are the people who were quoted 5, they waited 5, and they're the happiest group. Obviously, the people who are much less happy are the people who were quoted 5 and waited 7. These are the people who were quoted 7, and although it doesn't look that different, in fact, the satisfaction is lower for those who waited 5 than those who waited 7, and it's statistically significant with a P of 0.03. So indeed, they are actually less happy if you quote them 7 and they wait 5. Now, if you think about how we set up this experiment, it makes sense, right? Because we've quoted them 7 and then we've kind of fooled them or whatever by having this button pop up at 5. And even though they did, these are the people who successfully completed the experiment, even though they did hit next, they're not happy with us, right? They're like, oh, I could have missed out on my payment by missing the next button. Why are they popping this next button up at 5 when I expected to get it to 7? So this is the best we could come up with in terms of trying to replicate the situation where your delivery person shows up at 6:30 a.m. when you're 6 a.m. when you're asleep, right? So you've been sleeping, but here they show up, and indeed you are a bit less happy than if it had actually shown up when we quoted it. So yeah, we do have evidence that that being early might actually be a good thing, and we're going to put that into our model. So it's not entirely clear how to model this situation where the quotes then form a reference point that then feed into customer satisfaction. So we're going to build 3 models here. The first of which is a static model, which is really just a building block model. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to consider a static model here, because in a sense, this is by nature dynamic. But let's start building it with a static model. So we've got a monopolist service provider, MM1Q, balking, because we're going to be providing a price and a quote. We've got some potential market size of capital lambda. The customers, it's just a static model, unobservable, they don't have any visibility. So they're going to take the quote as a reference point, and they're going to experience a cost that's an interaction between their weight and the quote. They also receive a reward R from service. And so they make their joining decision, because we've got balking, based on their expected utility. So we're leaving the cost function general for now, but we're going to make it specific very soon. But if we allow ourselves a very general cost function, then it's actually easiest to look at Laplace transforms, doesn't really matter. But basically there are three, so we have to talk about equilibria here, right? Because we've got homogeneous customers making decisions based on their expected utility. So what are the equilibria that can arise? Well, not surprisingly, if the cost of weighting / quote is higher than you'd expect to pay, so this is again reward minus price, then everybody leaves, balks. You know, we've got no queue, there's nobody there. Similarly, if we make these costs low enough, then everybody joins, and so there's no balking, everybody joins, not particularly interesting. So the more interesting case is the equilibrium in the strategy, equilibrium in the middle. Remember, we've left our cost function general, so we've written this as if there exists a equilibrium lambda that solves this equation, then we can find an equilibrium. Obviously, as soon as you start putting nice condition, try and make C nice, then one can show there does exist a lambda that solves this. But for now, let's just keep it as general as you like. So if there's a lambda that solves this, then there'll be a fraction QE that choose to join. And so basically the customers are playing a mixed strategy, and QE of them are joining and 1 minus QE of them are not. And so if there's a unique solution to this equation, then this is actually a unique equilibrium. Okay. So, what are we actually trying to do here? In this case, actually, the firm's problem and the social planner's problem are the same thing. So I didn't talk about whether we were trying to maximize profit for the firm, right? Price times arrival rate, or whether we were trying to maximize the utility of the customers, in which case arrival rate times the customer utility, because they actually turn into exactly the same thing, because the firm would price to extract all utility, because it's a monopolist. So, so solvable problem in theory, but now let's see if we can get a bit more. In fact, let's base our customer waiting time. And we did actually do, with our empirical work, we did actually look whether a quadratic cost or a piecewise linear fit better. Piecewise linear actually fit better for us. So that's what we're going to use here, is a piecewise linear cost function. So our piecewise linear cost function, remember this is weight, this is quote. So it's linear in your quote. We don't like longer quotes. It's linear in your expected weight. We don't like longer weights. And then you've got this added term for your misquote. So if your quote is longer than your weight, you're not happy. If your weight is longer than your quote, you're really not happy. Okay, so you've got this extra boosting factor. So yeah, so we can solve this, and we can solve things in closed form, which is kind of nice. So we can find out what our optimal quote is, and we can find our optimal price if we have one. Maybe we're solving the social optimal, in which case we don't need one. We can find our arrival rate. And what's more interesting is there certainly are situations where you would quote less than the expected wait. So this is the expected waiting time when the arrival rate is lambda. And so for certain ranges of this extra boost that you get from being unhappy, then you'll actually quote less than the wait versus more than the wait. So we can also bound how unhappy you are. That's possibly less interesting, but you certainly don't quote. I mean, and anyone sure everybody on the screen is familiar enough to know that you're not going to quote your expected waiting time, right? As a firm, it's very, very unlikely that you're going to quote the expected waiting time, because you've got a asymmetric function in terms of people's utility. But what's sort of interesting is, so magically you might if beta turns out to be here, but most of the time you're not, and you might quote shorter, you're more likely to quote longer. So that's the static model. And so the static model is the only one we can solve in closed form. So, but it's, as I said, it's more of a building block. Let's go to the dynamic model. And so first, let's start with the observable system, which is certainly simpler. So we've got a first come, first serve MM1Q with balking, just like before. And now we're actually going to do state dependent quotes. And it's an observable system, so the customers have visibility, but for this simple model, we're going to take the quote as a reference point, and they're not going to base it based on the system information. So in some sense, this is an extreme case of the real system, right? Because in the real system, if the queue was observable, they would then, modify their reference point in their mind based on what they actually see. Now, that's an extension we haven't looked at, but I think, there's all the cheap talk literature out there in terms of, if customers don't trust the quote, they basically ignore it. I think in practice, customers don't totally ignore the quote. So this is the sort of, as I said, sort of the extreme case where they totally trust the quote. So again, the firm's problem and the social planner's problem are the same thing. So we don't have to worry if we're maximizing expected profit for the firm or maximizing utility for our customers. And in this case, what we can show is that there exists an optimal stationary policy that is threshold. So not too surprising. There are likely other optimal stationary policies, but at least one of them is threshold. So, what do I mean by threshold? I mean, when the queue is longer than some K, all customers are rejected. Well, we're not actually rejecting them. We're just giving them quotes that make them go away, right? So we can quote them a price or a delay that's, ridiculously long, and they'll go away. So there is a K where we basically choose to quote something that make people go away above that K, and anybody below it stays, which means that now what we've effectively got is an MM1K system. So, what we're trying to maximize here is our quotes associated with being in state 1, state 2, state K-1, and our choice of K, right? Because we're restricting attention to this optimal stationary policy that's threshold, we have reduced our optimization to just these variables, right? So it's choosing the K and it's choosing the quotes associated with each of those states. And therefore, what's the total utility? Well, this is the probability that I have N customers in an MM1K system. And I'm going to add that up over 0 to K minus 1. I'm going to scale it by our maximum total arrival rate. So of course, this is our actual number of arrivals if we took off the extra utility bit. And then, what does the customer receive? They receive their reward R minus an expected cost, this interaction between what they actually wait. And again, we have to have a little N on here because it is a dynamic system, and what we've quoted them tau in, right? Overall, given that there are N customers in the system. So if you solve this problem, it is solvable. You can't get it in explicit anymore. You just have to basically use a cumulative Poisson. And again, we're restricting attention to our piecewise linear cost functions. But if you restrict attention to this nice piecewise linear cost function, then you can find the optimal quotes. And in some cases, those optimal quotes will actually be less than the expected weight, but again, they're state dependent. So the optimal quote when there's N people will be might be less than the actual expected weight when there's N conditional on there being N people. But that's a bit unrealistic, right? We've assumed that people are using these reference points even though they can see the queue. So let's also look at the other extreme, which is the unobservable system. We'll continue to assume first come, first serve with balking. And we'll have state dependent prices and quotes again, but now the customers don't actually have visibility. So again, we're going to make a somewhat restrictive assumption, which is that they're not going to be learning that these prices and quotes are state dependent and therefore are actually, so they're like our MTERP people, right? They show up, they've given a quote, they're clearly using that quote as a reference point, but the fact that it's state dependent, if they were doing this lots of times, they'd then be able to use the quote to say a bit more, give them information. But we're going to ignore that, right? We're going to say this is the only time they're showing up. So they're actually going to take this quote just as it is. And so they're not going to then try and interpret the weight based on this quote. They're going to interpret the weight based on some overarching sort of average. So there's more work to be done here, I think, but that's what we're doing for this problem. So if we want to maximize the firm's problem, we can again show that there's a threshold policy that's optimal, and therefore we can restrict attention to our MM1K queuing system, so we can write it explicitly. And what's different here is because it's unobservable, we've lost our little N here. And so what happens with an unobservable system is actually there's only a single quote. Well, there's two quotes. There's the quote where you want them to go away because you're above K. But then there's the quote where you want them to stay and you actually give them a completely uninformative quote. So we're back to kind of this idea of cheap talk, which Gadlon and other people have looked at. This idea that you're actually not going to be telling them much information because, and again, remember, we're trying to solve the firm's problem. The social optimal one in this case will actually look a bit different. But for the firm actually ends up giving them a quote that tells them no information. So the firm does not differentiate the quote. So the optimal thing for the firm to do is to not differentiate the quote based on the dynamic system. They'll just give the same quote. Now, the social planners system is social planners problem is actually harder to solve and no longer corresponds to the firm's problem. So the social planner who wants to make the customers the happiest will actually tailor their quote to the length of the queue, right? Because if you want your customers the happiest, you're going to tailor it to the actual length of the queue. So now if we go to so that was all for general quote functions for the unobservable system. If we go to our specific ones, we can get solutions for the firm problem. As I mentioned, it's an easier problem. Again, they're, solutions to this sort of equation that has cumulative Poisson in it. And again, we can show there are situations where you're going to quote less than the expected weight, just as in the other systems. And so, of course, it's simpler because we just have this one quote that we're actually giving. So that's where we are in this research. As I mentioned, that's sort of one paper turning into two papers, maybe more papers, because as we realize things get more and more complex. Also because it's very hard to publish empirical work beside a model, unfortunately. So we're actually pulling those apart. So we're actually going to have one paper that does the empirical and then one or more papers that look at the second piece of it, the modeling piece of it. And so we find that weights both longer and shorter than the quote negatively affect satisfaction in our particular experiment, but I don't think it's too hard to think of examples in the real world where that might also be true, where shorter weights take you by surprise and are not actually a bonus. So we've based our models largely on experimental evidence, and certainly this piecewise linear seemed not a bad fit in terms of the empirical evidence. And we've identified these conditions where it's optimal to underquote. But there's a lot more to be done in terms of thinking through the equilibria here, right? So in terms of our unobservable and our observable, we've kind of taken these extreme cases, but really one needs to be thinking through the full equilibrium where people are learning and rational to get some sort of better model of customer behavior, I think. But I think the fact that in the unobservable system, you actually only quote that one quote, if you're a profit maximizing firm, it makes it less unrealistic, right? Because there is no learning. You're just getting this single quote that the firm's telling you this is well, I'm shipping my stuff to Melbourne, I didn't get I don't think the quote I got was particularly dependent on the state of the system, right? I just say, here's your quote, it's how long it takes. Yeah, so that was the first part. As I said, I've got more broader work. My Apple Watch died, so I don't actually have a time. So let me just see what the time is. We've got lots of time. So let me talk a little bit more broadly, but before I do that, if are there questions on this particular work that people have? Yeah, Peter.
So Tava, this is I think quite interesting. Let me just verify, in your model, when the customer joins, they get a quote.
Yes.
But that's the only quote they get.
Correct.
So they don't get updated quotes as they sit in the queue.
No.
And I guess that it would only make sense if they were allowed to renege and leave the queue. But I guess that, I guess when I'm sitting on one of these online queues and they tell me, oh, your expected waiting time is whatever, and then I keep getting updates. Sometimes, it does seem to me that's the situation too. So have you or anyone else looked at that type of situation from this point of view?
I haven't, but Lawrence Debo, Rob Chomsky, and Sina Ansari have at least one, maybe a couple of papers. So they're looking in the context of an emergency department, and they have some really nice work that combines both modeling and empirics. So they were actually allowed to do some real field experiments in an emergency department by pushing up wait times on a screen and then observing patient behavior in terms of, because leaving without being seen, which is also something I've done a bit of work on, is a real problem for emergency departments. You know, there was a news story in Auckland just a month ago about a patient who'd left, you know, things were really busy, they left without being seen, and they ended up dying because they hadn't got the treatment that they needed, right? So, so if we can reduce leaving without being seen, reneging, that's actually could have huge health benefits. So the work they're doing is looking at indeed these updated quotes and trying to reduce patients leaving without being seen. And what is in common with our work is, again, you don't always, telling the truth is not, yeah, well, first of all, what is the truth, right? If I give you a lead time quote, there's stochasticity, right? So I'm never going to get it 100% accurate. And so if all you do is quote the mean, you're going to make, you know, if it's symmetric, you're going to have unhappy people half the time, right? So most of the time you don't want to quote the mean anyway. So yeah, so it's kind of how do you estimate these in a way that you're sort of misleading people, but in a good way so that they stay. Yeah, no, it's very interesting work that they've been doing. So they're at Dartmouth. Any other questions?
I have a quick one, but I could also save it for the end if you'd prefer.
Right,
but I was just wondering, so the example I've been carrying around in my head is like online food order pickup, because there I am unhappy if it's earlier than me, because then the food is getting cold. And I was just wondering if you would think that this should carry through to a situation where I don't actually observe the misquote if it's early. Like I have some noise, you know, maybe the food is a little bit colder, but it's not like I get there earlier than the food is ready and I wait exactly a certain amount of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a modeling perspective, you'd still kind of do it our way because your food is getting colder and colder. So your dissatisfaction is probably, I mean, it's probably not linear, someone, you know, in terms of, but there's probably some sort of, you know, the colder the food is, the unhappier you are. That's a really good example though of this. But yeah, you're right. You don't actually observe it. So it's not the reference point effect. It's the cold food effect, I think. So,
right.
Interesting point. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this general area, not so much the fact that quotes affect satisfaction, but this idea of lead time quotation and MAC to all the services work I've been thinking about for quite a while. And so I have older work with Barish Atta and Mustafa, his former student, and then Ricardo and Valeri, who are co-authors on this work. So, you know, one of the motivating examples, and I realize this isn't service, but we can maybe stretch it to service in terms of lead time quotation, is this idea of quoting lead times for cars. So Ford and GM a while ago wanted people to be able to custom order cars and get delivery in 3 to 5 days. It never happened. You know, and I think part of why it never happened is because they never kind of worked out how to actually do this sort of quoting and pricing. In Germany, apparently about 60% is make to order, but it's, you know, you're talking 3-month lead times. So if you're going to do any sort of lead time quotation, you also have to, and differentiating our customers, you also have to do some sort of priority for the people who are actually getting it sooner. So you have to do some sort of scheduling of your queue. So I also a while ago asked my MBA students, would they pay more to get their cars sooner? They weren't exactly paying huge amounts of money here, but certainly, clearly, you know, people are somewhat willing to pay more to get things earlier. But the other thing is it wasn't quite obvious what the utility function should be here. So yeah, so this is kind of the scenario that we've been, I've been thinking about for a while, which is the idea that you're quoted a menu and lead time and pricing. So if we put this into a service setting, you're probably not talking $1,000, but there's the idea that you're offering a menu is really just sort of the Amazon model, right? Except that it's not quite like that. There's your super saver, there's your regular, and then there's your express. And maybe there's two types of express. So the idea that customers are quoted of prices and lead times is really not a new idea. But where it gets more interesting, I think, is the fact that if you've actually got a capacity in your queuing system, right? So there's fundamentally, you've got a queuing system there, it has capacity, you have control of the scheduling order, how you're actually who you're going to prioritize, and you have control of the menu. One of the questions sort of unanswered questions, I think, is really, when should this change dynamically and when should it be a static menu? How much benefit do you get from a dynamic menu? And the idea is this is a queuing system with capacity. It's not a delivery system with, basically lots and lots of parallel trucks. So the idea is either a service environment or make to order mass customization, something that's major and infrequent. Your product can be online, or you just go into your furniture store and they tell you, okay, you choose your style of couch, you choose your fabric. Most of the time they just say, okay, 8 weeks, we'll get it to you. But what they really should be doing is typing into their enterprise system and saying, but for an extra $300, we can get it to you in 2 weeks. So, if you've got your mother-in-law coming to visit and you need a couch in 2 weeks, you might actually be willing to pay that to get your new couch. So I think there's lots and lots of settings where this idea of lead time pricing and quotation holds. As I say, basically it's a queuing system. So it needs to be either a make to order situation or a service environment. As soon as we start holding inventory, things, it's a very different problem, right? So the problem I'm interested in is the make to order or the service one, where we've got a queuing system and no inventory. We've got uncertain demand, because that's also what makes everything interesting. But we've also got some sort of capacity constraints. Your revenue needs to depend in some sense on your lead time. So customers are willing to pay more to get it sooner, or maybe get a discount to get it later. You need customers that are somewhat heterogeneous most of the time, although Barish, in my first paper in this setting, had homogeneous customers. And then this idea that quotes affect satisfaction is our latest piece of work in this area. But there's still, a lot of modeling decisions that one can make in this area. So there are papers out there looking at competition based on lead time. It's not something I've really looked at much myself, but clearly firms do compete on those lead times. So, quoting, so most of the time I'm thinking about the setting, like the car or the couch or the service environment, where you kind of got this one-time thing and you're not going there based on the particular menu of lead times and prices. You're going there because you actually want that specific product or service. So yeah, but clearly lots of work that can still be done in terms of competition on lead time, although there is a big stream. And then this idea of static versus dynamic prices, again, I think we have to start referencing some of the human behavior literature, because while we can clearly get much better performance for the firm if we allow ourselves dynamic pricing, we might be making our customers so unhappy that it would be better to offer a static menu, because customers don't like these prices changing all over the place. although it depends on the environment. Airlines change prices all the time, right? So, I think there's more work there to be studied on what's the benefit of dynamic, what's the cost, when do you do dynamic pricing versus static pricing. Again, there's some literature in that area, but I think there's still more one can do. And if you're talking static versus dynamic, you can also think static versus dynamic in terms of your lead time quotation, right? And that customers will have almost certainly have more willingness to accept those the sort of dynamic lead time quotes than dynamic pricing. But I think there's more, again, back to behavioral work that could be done in that area. There's surprisingly little behavioral literature looking at the whole lead time quotation side of things. It's a very thin research area. So I think we could do more in terms of understanding the behavioral side so that then we can feed them into better models. And then, what model do you have for arrivals? What model do you have for service? Is your capacity actually fixed, or can you run overtime? When do you quote it? This idea of maybe you do updates. Yeah, and then, lead time dependent revenue, lead time dependent satisfaction, all sorts of variety of models possible in that area. So basically all my work has ignored lead time competition. We've got stochastic and exogenous arrivals, just as we did in the paper I just presented, and they balk if they don't like the combination, just as we had in our satisfaction. If we're actually doing these quotations, often it makes sense to think of them as multiples of a time slot, because that's actually how things appear in practice. That's not what we did in our satisfaction paper. We had it continuous, but in practice, you don't quote people most of the time, especially if you're quoting in days. You don't quote 3.15 days. And then, most of my work assumes this fixed quota that can be produced. Again, we had a simpler model in the paper I just presented. So my first work on this with Burishata, which is now a while ago, just had homogeneous customers, but what was actually, I thought, quite cool about it is what we found was asymptotically optimal was this artificial segmentation into two classes where most of your customers are quoted a short or reasonably short lead time, and then the remaining are quoted quite a long lead time. And so, so most of your customers get something good, but you've got this long, thin tail that allows you to account for the stochasticity that you're dealing with. So when we look at this in terms of numerics, this is just one set of numerics. You can admit many more customers. Instead of turning people away at 182, you turn people away at 365. 92% of your customers are getting a delay of 1 or 2 periods, but then the other 8% are getting some delay quotes that look like this, and you're making 67% more money. So there's a real benefit to sort of clever scheduling, even when you have homogeneous customers. So if you have heterogeneous, you're going to get even more benefit, right? But this idea that everybody's first come, first serve is not going to get you there, right? So first come, first serve, even if you would think homogeneous customers, but if you do something cleverer, you can actually get quite a big benefit there. So I think there is something to dynamic, clever scheduling. So as I mentioned, this is maybe I should have put the dates on there. This is old work with Burishata. We also looked at, so that was just looking at homogeneous customers. We also did heterogeneous customers looking at social optimality. We looked at revenue maximization, but with only 2 classes. And then, I've sort of gone back to the static model with Ricardo, looking at the fact that you could actually expedite, which, then if you can expedite, then you can guarantee your lead times, which is sort of an implicit in some of these asymptotic results. You kind of can guarantee because it's asymptotically you're guaranteeing, but if you take it away from asymptoting, then you kind of need to expedite to guarantee your quotation. So that's what this work is. And then the paper I just presented is our most recent work where we added on Valeri because the behavioral work is really his area. So obviously that was a super high level view, but I think, if we go back to this kind of page, there's still, and a lot of other people have done work in this area, but I don't really feel like we have all the answers, like all the answers in terms of how should a firm think about its lead time, quotation, and pricing. When should it do the dynamic static? If it's doing dynamic, do our algorithms good, or do you actually want to go to some of the, the second speaker's talk? I don't know. I think there's all sorts of interesting things in there. So yeah, so that's my presentation.